Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to our November panel discussion of the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. The title of our event tonight is Climate Security as a Human Right, and we're going to look at one of the alternative approaches to moving forward on adaptation and mitigation to climate crisis. Welcome to this event. In 1965, going back a little ways, the president of the American Petroleum Institute, API, which is the major fossil fuels trade group, told members that burning their products could cause marked changes in climate. And, I quote, "There's still time to save the world's peoples from the catastrophic consequences of pollution, but time is running out." That's 1965. If you add up the total financial cost of the approximately 400 weather and climate disasters that have happened in the US alone since 1980, in which overall damages and costs reached or exceeded $1 billion, you get the sum of $2.755 trillion. These are very large numbers, but they actually underestimate the scale of the current situation. Efforts are being made all over the world to induce the courts to recognize the problem of climate change as a waste management problem first and a human rights problem second, or maybe it's the other way around, a human rights problem first and a waste management problem second. There's a lot of flexibility in the human rights approach, not least because it applies globally. It's a very general approach, and there has been some progress, which we'll hear about tonight, in the last few years, in getting various courts to agree with this. There's not much doubt that the next 4 years in this country are going to be very difficult, and they're going to be conflictual. Progress is likely to be very slow. It'll be challenging to stay engaged and to stay as positive as possible, but we hope that everyone will, because in moments when contrarian political actors feel they've been granted the license to dictate, that's exactly when the public needs to get extra engaged, extra active, make it clear that there's still a majority of people in this country who want government action on the climate crisis in our defense and defense of the public. And that's true even if that majority doesn't always vote. On the bright side, there is a growing global trend toward recognition that governmental and industrial actors have responsibilities to protect the public, the natural world, from avoidable damages. Now, before I introduce our guest speakers for today, let's remind ourselves that this event takes place in Ndakina, meaning our land, which is the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and the Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge, we honor the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout the generations. Also, this event is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording when it's ready. Is that true, by the way? Are we in recording mode? Excellent. And as always, please do keep your microphones on mute and use the chat for your questions and comments, which we'll get to as soon as we can. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. We're extremely pleased to be able to call on 3 experts who are right in the thick of things when it comes to climate litigation in the common interest. And I'll introduce all 3 right now, and then we'll launch into our conversation. Dr. Carly Phillips is an ecosystem scientist with advanced degrees in biology and ecology, who did extensive research on wildflower wildfire impacts, and forest carbon dynamics. Her current position is as research scientist with the Science Hub for Climate Litigation at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she conducts research to support steps toward strategic climate litigation and fossil fuel company accountability. In that position, she collaborates extensively with other experts within UCS and in other organizations, and is a leader in the developing community of practice among scientists doing research relevant to these goals. And I've asked Dr. Phillips to start out the conversation by laying out some of the emerging landscape within the US and outside it, and sharing with us some of UCS's current projects around climate litigation. Then Mike Meno is Communications Director for the Center for Climate Integrity, where he oversees the organization's communications strategies, public messaging, and media relations. Since 2017, CCI has been combining expertise in law, science, advocacy, and strategic communications to help build the movement toward legal clarity on climate accountability. CCI provides resources, strategic guidance, and campaign support to communities engaged in legal actions to defend themselves against current and future climate damage. Before joining CCI in 2019, Mike spent a decade leading communications programs for nonprofit advocacy groups, including the American Civil Liberties Union, and he now lives in Lebanon, New Hampshire, just up the road from me. And finally, but definitely not least, New Hampshire Representative Tony Caplan graduated from Yale and worked first as a journalist in Mexico, Central America, and in London, and then for over 20 years worked as a Spanish teacher in Manchester, Hillsborough, and Lebanon, New Hampshire. He now represents the towns of Henniker, Bradford, and Warner in the state legislature, and has also served as chair of the Henniker Energy Committee, vice chair and chair of the Henniker Democratic Town Committee, and as town soccer coach. Rep. Caplan will bring us up to date on some efforts being made right here in New Hampshire. So we're totally looking forward to that. And let's start by getting the big picture from Dr. Carly Williams.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here.
Yep, please do.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Carly Phillips. I'm a research scientist with the Science Hub for Climate Litigation at the Union of Concerned Scientists. As Brenmar said, my goal is to set the stage for everyone about where we're at globally with climate litigation and what are some of the most recent cases that have had rulings that are important to inform the overall conversation. And so if you're not familiar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're a nonprofit based, we're national. We have an office in Cambridge. I'm based in Massachusetts myself. And our goal is to put rigorous science to work for a healthier planet and safer world. We lead with solutions. And in that vein, one of those solutions can be climate litigation. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work that we do within the Science Hub for Climate Litigation, because I think it really shows how important climate science is, not only in underlying our ability to talk about climate change and to describe the problem, but also as foundational evidence for the types of cases that we're currently seeing. All right, just give me 1 second. I'm going to move this Zoom screen here. Great. So what we do at the Science Hub for Climate Litigation is a couple of things. We conduct litigation relevant research, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on this evening. We also build a community of scientists who can engage in this space. Climate litigation is really new. There aren't that many people, much less scientists, who are working in this space. And so having scientists that can communicate to judges, that can communicate to lawyers, legal scholars, is really important to making sure that the best available evidence and the most up-to-date science is informing these cases. We also make sure that this kind of science is accessible. There are paywalls, there are communication issues. Journal articles are dense and sometimes, even as a scientist, for me, very boring. And so it's good to have a intermediary between the scientists, the legal community, and folks who might be advocating or suggesting that they would like climate litigation filed on their behalf. And so we do that as well. And then finally, we also provide direct legal support to legal teams who are conducting these cases. And so to set the stage, this is a figure that shows the trend of climate litigation globally. So on your y-axis, you've got the number of cases, and on the x-axis, you've got the year. And you can see that really since 2015, things have taken off. Just 20 years ago, lawsuits that touched any part of climate change were really rare. There were about 10 cases globally then, and 8 of them were in the US. But between 2016 and 2019, more than 100 cases were filed around the world. They're brought against governments, to enforce human rights considerations, and against private companies, which I know Mike is going to talk about in a lot more detail later. But in the US alone, there have been over 24 lawsuits that have been filed by states, municipalities, against fossil fuel companies seeking compensation. And this figure was produced by folks at the London School of Economics, who are really centerpieces in this climate litigation conversation. And so to provide an overview of climate in the courts and how this is working, I'm going to start by talking about cases that have been brought against governments. And so one of the big ones, most of these had rulings or developments within the past year or so. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a really dynamic space where there's a lot of activity happening all the time when it comes to these cases, some of which were filed almost a decade ago now. So in Klimas and Joran versus Switzerland, there was a group of older Swiss women who sued the Swiss government, saying that they're woefully inadequate is one of the quotes from their filing, their woefully inadequate climate policies by the Swiss government were violating their human rights. And in particular, they raised the fact that older folks are more vulnerable to heat waves than other populations. And so they were particularly at risk due to the Swiss government's inaction on climate change. And this worked its way through the courts for several years, ultimately getting to the European Court of Human Rights, where they ruled that, in fact, by not taking more aggressive action, the Swiss government was violating the human rights of these women. And it was hailed as a huge victory. But then there was something kind of odd that happened. The Swiss parliament took that ruling and said, we're not going to comply. We're not going to take the action necessary to reduce our emissions more. We're doing enough already. And so this case, while there was this final ruling that said unequivocally that climate protection is a human right, they're still not really sure how that case is going to shake out in the end, given the Swiss government's hesitance to comply with that ruling. There's similar logic about violation of rights that is happening in some of the US youth cases. So Montana, Held versus Montana is a case that was also ruled on earlier this year. And it was brought by kids and teenagers who said that state agencies, by not considering the impact on climate change of fossil fuel projects, were violating their Montana state constitutional rights to a clean and healthy environment. And so the court ruled in their favor, but the impacts of that the enforcement of that rather, is going to require legislation and some sort of, state congressional intervention. And so again, the impacts of that really positive ruling have yet to be seen. And so these are the kind of broad and most recent cases that are in this space against government, where citizens are really pushing their governments to take more aggressive action and showing that they are violating their rights as citizens by not taking more aggressive climate action. The next bucket of cases are those that are against corporations. And I know Mike is going to talk about this a lot in the next presentation, particularly as it relates to cases that are happening in the US. But there are a couple of key cases to bring up that are occurring internationally. So one is Liuya versus RWE, which is a German fossil fuel producer and electricity company. And this is a Peruvian farmer and mountain guide. You can see this is a picture of Lake Palcachoca, which is the centerpiece of this case, particularly the glacial melt, that it's increasing the risk of a flood coming out of that lake. But this man in Peru, he sued this German energy company in a German court, claiming that they have increased the risk to him and his family by producing and extracting fossil fuels. This case was filed in 2015, and only last year in 2023 did members of the court from Germany go down and visit this site. So these cases are slow moving, but they are moving. And this is an example of one that really uses key pieces of evidence, like a database that has all the information about how the amount of pollution that's attributable to given fossil fuel companies, as well as attribution science, which I'll talk about later, which shows the direct consequences of climate change. And so that case is in process, and I'm really interested to see how that plays out. Another case is Milieu Defensi versus Shell, and there was a recent ruling. I think it was either earlier this week or last week. My time is all mixed up, but it was a really recent ruling. And this was a case that was brought against Shell by a group in the Netherlands, saying, and there was a ruling just a few years ago that said that, a real landmark ruling that said that Shell needed to reduce their emissions, their scope 1 and 2 emissions, by 45%. But what happened either this week or last week is that that ruling was overturned by the appeals court in The Hague, the Court of Appeals in The Hague, excuse me, and said that while Shell had a duty to a duty of care to manage its emissions, that they were not able to prescribe the 45% reduction. And so again, when we're thinking about these cases, they're really, it's an exciting space for climate accountability and for pushing governments, but the results have been exciting, but also very slow as these cases roll out. And I know that Mike, again, is going to talk more about the US states and municipalities that have sued recently as well, really seeking that corporate accountability. And finally, I want to mention, these aren't cases, these aren't litigation in the traditional sense, but they're really shaping the conversation. And these are international advisory opinions that are currently underway in the courts that have the potential to shape the way that courts across the globe think about climate change as a human right, and about the responsibilities that states have to act on climate change. And so these advisory opinions are underway. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea already produced an opinion that said that greenhouse gas is a marine pollution and that states have an obligation to regulate it. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights also has a pending opinion, and next month, the opinion proceedings for the International Court of Justice are going to begin. And so these are huge opinions that, again, could really shape the way that law is interpreted across the world. And so now I'm going to talk about something that's very close to my heart, which is the science that underlies these cases, which is a key component of the evidence base that lawyers are using to push these cases forward. And attribution science is, in many of these cases, the underpinning evidence. And so this is research that identifies and quantifies the human contributions to climate change and its impacts. And there are a couple of different subfields that allow us to say different things about how humans are impacting the climate. So there's trend attribution, for instance, which is the type of science that allows us to understand that humans have driven human activity rather have driven temperature increases over the past 150 years or so. That's the kind of science that's there. There's also extreme event attribution science, which has gotten a lot of media attention lately. It's the kind of science that shows that the heat wave that happened in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was, some studies show, virtually impossible without climate change. Others say that it was a 1 in 1,000 year event, but those show how rare that type of heat wave was. And there are studies like this for lots of different impacts, including floods, other precipitation events, and many others, droughts, etc. There's also source attribution. And this is an exciting field that we work on a lot at UCS, which allows us to trace the source of pollution to an individual fossil fuel company and show how those companies have contributed to various impacts. For instance, in aggregate, 90 companies have contributed to more than half of temperature increase. And so these studies provide a lot of power to show just how impactful the actions of these few companies have been. And then finally, there's impact attribution, which allows us to understand not just the consequences climatically, but also the consequences for individuals and large groups of people. So these might quantify the number of deaths that occurred in a heat wave that are attributable to human-caused climate change. And that's really an emerging field and, the next step of attribution science. Studies like this are cited across different types of cases, and again, really provide the foundation to link human-caused climate change and a given trend or event. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the evidence that goes hand in hand with attribution science, and that is evidence of fossil fuel deception and obstruction. Reinmar opened this session with a great quote that illustrates this exact point, that industry scientists knew and understood the impact of fossil fuels and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere more than 50 years ago, that they misrepresented climate change during congressional hearings and through wide dissemination of mis and disinformation to the public, and that many of these things are continuing to occur by these large industry actors. And so this really underscores the importance of cases that hold these companies accountable, and that use evidence not just from the physical sciences, not just from climate science, but also from the social sciences that really demonstrate the importance of holding these groups accountable. Thanks so much for your time. This is a really exciting space. I'm happy to talk with you all about this exciting and new frontier of climate litigation, and I'll look forward to hearing your questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly. Awesome describing the landscape that we have in front of us here that's opening up. Next up, we have Mike Meno from CCI. Do you want to share your screen, Mike?
Yeah, I'll do a quick intro. Hey, I'll share my screen real quick. Hey everyone, so good to be with you. I'm Mike Meno. As Reinmar mentioned, I work with an organization called the Center for Climate Integrity. We're a nonprofit. We work all over the United States, and our mission is to help communities in legal efforts to hold big oil companies accountable for their role in the climate crisis. Because as Carly was mentioning at the end there, we all know that we are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis. Like that American Petroleum Institute example Reinmar shared, we know that giant fossil fuel corporations decades ago knew their products would raise global temperatures and have, to quote just one internal document from ExxonMobil, potentially catastrophic effects on the global climate and on civilization. Did they share that information? Of course, no, they didn't. They launched the most consequential deception campaign of all time, one that we're all paying the price for now. So across the United States, I'm going to actually, in the chat, I'm going to drop a link to our website, the Center for Climate Integrity, if anyone is interested in learning more about our work there. And now I'll share my screen. Let's see, which I do have access to do. So when I say CCI focuses on helping efforts to hold big oil accountable, our work principally focuses on supporting these climate accountability lawsuits against fossil fuel companies in the U.S. that Carly was just mentioning. Okay, here I have my permissional set up here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those cases right now. So can folks...
Looks good. It's coming up.
Good. Okay, great. Here I have some other windows open, but let me see if I can get ignore my tabs. So across the United States, there are currently 8 states, 2 tribal governments, and dozens of local and municipal governments from Hawaii all the way to Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C. You can see them broken down here, that in some form or another are taking fossil fuel companies to court to make them pay for deceiving the public about their products' role in climate change. Now, these lawsuits are a very powerful tool for corporate accountability, but at the top, I want to say what these lawsuits aren't. None of these lawsuits are attempting to solve climate change. They are not attempting to regulate emissions. They are not attempting to mitigate the problem. In the United States, under our system of law, in some European countries, there are cases that are based on human rights. But here, within the limits of the court system of what state and local governments can bring, most of the climate litigation to date has been focused on corporate accountability. Now, you can see here that these cases are all over the country. And in fact, today, 1 in 4 people in the United States are living somewhere that is suing ExxonMobil or other big oil companies as part of these suits. So I hope folks have heard of these, but if you haven't, don't worry, you're not alone. And what I want to do today actually is zoom in on some of the cases close to us. It's great to be with a group of fellow New Englanders. The lawsuits in New England, I think, provide really interesting examples of the types of climate accountability lawsuits that we've seen across the country. So I live in the Upper Valley. I'm right on the border with Vermont. There are generally 2 buckets of cases that these lawsuits fall into. One is focused on consumer protection. These are cases where usually state attorneys general are saying, you, big oil company, have lied to the consumers in our state about the harm your products would cause, and we want you to stop lying and pay certain remedies for those damages. That is the type of lawsuit that Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut have all filed. So Connecticut and Massachusetts are each suing just ExxonMobil under their state's consumer protection law. Vermont has a consumer protection case against Exxon, Shell, Sunoco, and a couple other companies. Rhode Island, which was actually the first state in the country to file one of these lawsuits, their lawsuit falls into the other bucket, which focus on damages. These are about recouping the costs of climate change and helping to pay for climate adaptation costs. Our mantra at CCI, when we're trying to describe these cases globally, is talking about the big oil companies. They knew, they lied, and they need to pay. So each lawsuit's a little different in terms of which companies are being sued. These cases are also all brought under state laws, so they're all designed to be enforcing the laws of Vermont, the laws of Massachusetts. they are, so they're not all one size fits all, not all the same, but they do all broadly fit into this greater bucket of seeking to hold the companies most responsible for the climate crisis through their not just pollution, but importantly, their deception, right? The fact that they lied to the public and to policymakers for decades, took a page out of Big Tobacco's playbook and lied about the harms they knew their products would cause. Well, now, just like tobacco and opioid companies and any other, bad corporate actor you can think of, they are now having to face accountability in court to stop the deception and to pay in various ways that I can talk about for some of the harms that they've caused. So what are these lawsuits about generally? Like I said, they're about paying for the damages that they caused. We're talking about, if you go back to this big slide, a lot of coastal communities, communities facing wildfires. You have places like Boulder, Colorado, where they had the Marshall Fire, Maui, Hawaii, where they had the Lahaina Fire, just totally destroyed communities, coastal communities dealing with sea level rise. But even places like Minnesota, right? Like nowhere is untouched by climate change, and communities everywhere are trying to figure out how are we going to pay for the enormous cost to make our communities more resilient, to adapt, right? To strengthen bridges and roads and seawalls. And as the argument of these cases go, the companies that cause this problem, right, that impose these costs on communities, they should be paying their fair share. We should make polluters pay because it's not fair for these costs to fall entirely on taxpayers, when, of course, a relatively small number of corporations were not only responsible for the majority of fossil fuel pollution, but in fact, knew and lied about their chief role in it for years. And I'm going to come back to lying a lot in my comments because that is really the crux of these lawsuits, right? It's what the lawyers would call the tortious conduct. It's the fact that they lied about the impact they knew their products would have. So again, the tobacco and opioid comparison is really useful to a lot of folks. Corporations can't sell a dangerous product and then lie about it, right? And as we know from the tobacco and opioid examples, when the evidence of your lies gets introduced into court, you can be held accountable and not be able to lie to the public, pay for some of the damages that you caused. Now, as you might imagine, the companies that are facing these lawsuits, we're talking Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron. There are some cases like Connecticut and Massachusetts where maybe only one big oil company is the defendant. Connecticut and Exxon, they're just, Connecticut and Massachusetts, they're just suing Exxon. You have other states and communities, they're suing dozens of companies, right? But in general, the fossil fuel industry has fought these cases very harshly in court, and they have tried everything they can to get out of the courtroom. Because in their own words, this is one of my favorite quotes from a brief that they filed to the Supreme Court. These cases pose massive monetary liability for their industry. Why did they lie about climate change for so many years? Because they saw what needed to be done as a threat to their profits, right? Rather than read the clean energy revolution, they decided they were going to double down on fossil fuels. And of course, they're still doing that today, misleading the public about their investments in clean energy, running greenwashing ads. And a lot of these lawsuits, especially the ones that are focused on consumer protection, right? The ones that are trying to stop the companies from lying to consumers, a lot of them cite ongoing deception. They're not just saying, hey, you lied in the 70s, 80s, and 90s about climate change. It's not just the fact that, they participated in climate denial, but it's now that they pretend to be part of the solution, right? And I think we've all seen examples of these kind of greenwashing ads that the companies run without consequences. So big oil hates these cases, but they have done a very bad job to date. I'm just going to go back to this big map while we're talking about it so you can see the scope. They've done a very poor job to date of getting out of the courtroom. For many years, the cases were caught up in procedural fights. The first of these lawsuits was filed in 2017. That was the same year CCI was formed. really the impetus behind a lot of these cases was in 2015. If folks are familiar with the so-called Exxon New reporting that came out of the LA Times and Inside Climate News, it was the first time we had internal industry documents showing that behind the scenes, oil executives were being told by their own scientists, hey, if we keep doing what we're doing, it's going to be catastrophic, right? Another one of my favorite documents, the one from Shell that was only revealed in more recent years, they said if we continue on this course of fossil fuel pollution, civilization could prove a fragile thing, right? So they knew, but then they spend decades covering it up, muddying the science, lying. So these lawsuits start getting filed in 2017. Some have even been filed this year. City of Chicago, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, filed in 2024. More and more now to the point where we are at 1 out of every 4 Americans living somewhere suing big oil. The Attorney General of Michigan earlier this year announced plans to file one of these lawsuits. So that's something that we're watching in 2025. But in all those years, the companies have not managed. They've managed to delay the cases. They throw up legal hurdles. They've been locked down in jurisdictional fights, but they have not managed to escape trial. And in fact, Massachusetts is right now on course to potentially be the first out of all these cases to put ExxonMobil on trial. Maura Healey, now governor, then attorney general, filed that consumer protection lawsuit against ExxonMobil, and it's now entering a discovery phase where Exxon may have to turn over additional evidence that could be used against them in court. So the companies are terrified of these cases. They saw what happened to tobacco companies. They saw what happened to opioid companies. And even though courts across the country have largely given a green light to these cases moving ahead to trial, we're still, in all likelihood, maybe a year, 2 years away from these first cases actually going to trial. But you can imagine how monumental it will be and could be if some of these cases land in front of juries where they're trying to be heard, and all of a sudden the evidence of big oil's climate deception is just laid bare for the world to see. Currently, there are 2 cases before the Supreme Court where the oil companies are hoping to escape accountability. The Supreme Court has not agreed to hear either of these cases, but the oil companies have appealed. Just 2 cases I'm gonna reference really quickly. So one is right behind Massachusetts, which, as you may remember, I said there's sort of 2 buckets: consumer protection cases. So that's Massachusetts, right? They don't need to rely on attribution science very much to just say, hey, you portray yourselves as a company that is investing in algae. You're actually not doing that, right? This is ExxonMobil, greenwashing. You're lying to the public. We want you to stop lying. The case that is hopefully not going up to the Supreme Court, but the oil companies are trying to use it as a vehicle right now, is from Honolulu, Hawaii. This is in that other bucket, a damages case, where Honolulu is seeking to make oil companies pay for the cost of climate adaptation and resilience in Honolulu. And Honolulu, like Maui, has just seen really untold levels of climatic changes, damages. They need to pay a lot of money. They don't want it to fall on them and their taxpayers. They want the big oil companies to pay their fair share. A really historic decision from the Hawaii Supreme Court gave a green light that allows that lawsuit to enter into discovery, which I know I used that term before. Discovery is basically the pre-trial phase in a lawsuit where the 2 parties, in this case Honolulu and the oil companies, get to request documents from each other that might be cited as evidence in the cases and can potentially unearth new evidence, right? So this case is heading toward trial, and the oil companies have appealed one of those rulings from the Hawaii Supreme Court, and they are pleading with the United States Supreme Court to take up that case and hear it in the next term. The Supreme Court to date has largely stayed out of these cases. 3 separate times they refused to review lower court rulings on proper jurisdiction for these cases. And as an interesting side fact, Justice Alito has recused himself from many of these cases. He doesn't have to say why under the Supreme Court rules, but it's assumed it's because he owns some stock in Phillips, which is a defendant in many of these lawsuits. So you currently have only 8 justices trying to decide whether to take that Honolulu case. There's a second lawsuit that has been filed by 19 state attorneys general. I'll let you guess what political party those 19 state attorneys general are part of. That has been filed against 5 of the states that have sued big oil. They are suing California, Connecticut, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Rhode Island to basically say that those states' climate cases infringes on the rights of their states, and that they want the Supreme Court to essentially stop those cases from advancing, right? So these are not lawsuits filed by the big oil companies, but filed by other states trying to stop what these 5 attorneys general in those 5 states that I mentioned are trying to do to hold big oil accountable. Legal experts who have commented on that petition just say it is highly unusual, right? And they use more colorful language than that. However, the Supreme Court, and I should add, those 19 state attorneys general include the Attorney General of New Hampshire. So New Hampshire is technically part of the effort to try to undo those 5 and potentially other climate accountability lawsuits against big oil companies. I know many of us are probably noticing that New Hampshire is one of only 2 states in New England that has not sued big oil and is not fighting one of these lawsuits. So we have 2 efforts right now asking the Supreme Court to take these cases. The Supreme Court has not agreed to take either of these cases. I'm telling you this as a preview of things that might be in the news in the next few months. What the Supreme Court has done in both of those cases is they have asked the Department of Justice to weigh in, to say, hey, do you as the federal government think we should take these cases? So the Biden Justice Department right now has a ticking clock to weigh in on those cases before we have a new Department of Justice that might offer a different kind of opinion. President Biden campaigned on a pledge to strategically support climate lawsuits against polluters. The Justice Department under Merrick Garland has already filed 1 brief in support of communities in these cases. This is something to see if the Supreme Court is going to decide to get involved in these cases. We are hopeful that they will do what they have done in the past, which is to say this is for lower courts to decide, and we're going to let these cases continue. I don't have a slide for this, but I do want to mention one other state level development that might sound familiar to folks. When you hear making polluters pay, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about so-called state superfund bills, sometimes called polluters pay bills. Vermont was the first state in the country to pass one of these into law. This is another mechanism that states are looking at to make polluters pay, but they are very distinct from the climate accountability lawsuits I'm talking about. And I just want to touch on those really quickly, and I'm happy to, talk about this more in the questions. But essentially what those bills try to do is to charge major fossil fuel companies a fee for their pollution, right? So the math of who would pay what is something that would need to be determined. And we already know from the Vermont experience that these laws are going to be challenged in court. So Vermont is going to have to defend that Superfund law in court, right? So, some folks are tempted to think, oh, maybe legislation is a faster way to do that. But legislation and litigation are very different tools. They're trying to achieve very different ends. Where these lawsuits that I'm talking about are focused primarily on deception and the evidence of these companies lying, those bills are basically saying, we want you to pay a certain amount of money to help us adapt to the damages that your products cause, right? So otherwise, you can continue business as usual under those bills if you're an oil company. The bills are just saying that your business contributed to harm and you need to pay a price for that. Where the lawsuits have the power to stop the companies from lying, right? Go back to that tobacco example. Tobacco companies can't lie about the health harms of cigarettes anymore. And then they also include a whole wide range of remedies that I could, spend a whole hour talking about. There are some really fun ones out there. Connecticut is one of the states that is actually trying to make ExxonMobil fund a corrective public education campaign about climate change. If folks have ever seen commercials for that anti-smoking campaign, The Truth, what many people might not know is that the funding of that campaign actually comes out of the tobacco master settlement agreement, which was reached with the tobacco companies after they got sued by the federal government. So the tobacco companies are actually having to pay into a fund to provide nonpartisan, scientifically based public education about the harms of smoking. And states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, through their lawsuits, and Minnesota, excuse me, not Massachusetts, through their lawsuits are trying to make ExxonMobil do the same. I want to mention, before I turn it over to Representative Caplan, one other new type of litigation that started just this year and that my organization, CCI, has been extremely interested in. So one of the things we do at the Center for Climate Integrity, again, we are not plaintiffs in these cases. We do not bring these cases, but one of the many things we do is through going through archival work and other methods, we try to uncover and publicize evidence of big oil companies misleading the public about the harms their products have caused. And earlier this year, we released a report that you can see on the screen here called The Fraud of Plastic Recycling. You can read it on our website, where we documented through some never before seen evidence, but also compiling everything that was in the public record, how big oil companies and the petrochemical industry writ large have known for decades that plastics, which are a fossil fuel product, can never really be recycled at scale, right? The plastic recycling rate in the US has never gone above 10%. It averages around 5%, which is very depressing to hear and say. But big oil companies are investing a lot in plastic as the demand for oil and gas for fuel is going down. Plastics are as one advocate has said, big oil's plan B. And this is fueling a separate environmental crisis. Well, it turns out, just like these companies knew their products would cause climate change and lie about it, these same companies also knew that their plastic products could really never be recycled at scale, and they launched their own disinformation campaign to basically promote the fraud of plastic recycling. And now the world is drowning in plastic waste, and you're reading about the adverse impacts of plastic every other day. So we released this report, and at the same time, Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California, was investigating ExxonMobil for its role in the plastic pollution crisis. Well, in September, that investigation concluded, and California filed the first of its kind lawsuit against ExxonMobil to hold Exxon accountable for its role in the plastic waste crisis. We were very proud that our report was cited as evidence many times in that lawsuit. There are now other attorneys general. Just the other day, the AG of Connecticut said he's been exploring this same issue, who are now looking at this filing thinking, well, there's now evidence that would lead us to hold the oil and gas industry accountable for its role in this other massive pollution crisis, right? So I say this to say this is something else that I think folks should be keeping their eye on in 2025 is accountability for plastics deception. We're already seeing accountability for climate deception really amping up. But now, there's this sort of separate legal front that has been opened against the oil and gas companies. And just like the damages caused by climate change, you could imagine enormous damage caused by plastic pollution that these companies could potentially be liable for. So I know I've gone a lot of places. I'm gonna stop there, and I'm also just because I'm a Granite Stater, I'm gonna drop my email address here if anyone is interested in ever connecting or learning more about CCI's work. This is me. I'm Mike at climateintegrity.org.
Great, thank you so much, Mike Meno. It's awesome. I'm so glad that you brought out that the information about the plastics because we have a very active working group in the network working on plastic issues, both locally and farther afield. So I'm sure there are a lot of people on the call who will be very interested to hear about that, and we'll look forward to learning more as time goes by. So thanks so much for this. It's awesome to hear about these various approaches to this problem. And now we'll bring it down to home base here and hear from Representative Caplan about some movement right here in New Hampshire on this issue. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Reinmar, and thanks, Mike, for that great presentation. I'll just start out by giving you a little background. I've been following the climate discussion since the 1980s, when the first President Bush signed the Rio Treaty, the Rio Accords, that first committed the United States to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I've been waiting for significant action ever since then. I had hopes when President Clinton came in. He attacked the problem head on. He tried to introduce a BTU tax, and he got killed on that and never went back to anything on climate. His Vice President Gore promised to do something when he ran in 2000. As we know, he lost that election to President Bush Jr., who immediately reversed course, pulled the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the follow-on to the Rio Treaty, and opened up the White House to oil industry lobbyists to help him write his energy policy. And ever since then, the Republican Party dogma has been that climate science is a hoax and that it's some sort of left-wing conspiracy to introduce Marxism and to destroy the American way of life. So New Hampshire has not been immune to that mind virus, and we, as Mike noted, we're the hole in the donut of New England in terms of climate action, not only in litigation, but in sort of taking action to enact an energy transition and to get off of fossil fuels. So I got onto the legislature in 2020, and I was immediately struck by the level of climate denial that was taking place, the climate science denial that was taking place on the House floor. I heard Republican legislators calling it a hoax, saying that, climate change has been with us since the beginning of time, and this is no different, and just basically just denying the science and being a mouthpiece for the misinformation campaign that we know now has been run by the oil industry. So I'm going to share my screen now. I decided to introduce my House resolution in 2023, basically as an activist piece to fly the flag of climate science and to say this is a line in the sand. We're not going to stand for climate science denial anymore. And it was basically urging the state to join with our sister states in New England and around the country, municipalities and states that were taking legal action against the oil industry. And the basis of it was the state law, New Hampshire statutes against commercial fraud. We have taken part as a state in action against corporations that are deceiving consumers. The Volkswagen settlement is a good example of that, where Volkswagen was lying about its emissions, and so we were part of that case, and we received money as a result. So I didn't really expect this to pass. I mean, we're in the minority. It's a Republican, as I said, it's part of their dogma that they are going to defend the oil industry. I really don't know why, because we're far away from the oil industry. We're not Houston, but I guess follow the money is probably your best bet on that. Anyway, so the debate on this bill, as I expected, was bitter and partisan, but it was very informative to me because it really revealed the extent to which the Republican Party identified with oil companies as if this was something that was just innate in American identity to be, these are not just our oil companies, but this is us. I heard, legislators saying, why would we do that to ourselves? Why would we hurt ourselves by attacking the oil companies? And, I just found that so odd. When I go up to the mobile station in my town, I don't think that that's me or us or we. That's a company that's trying to make money from my use of oil. But anyway, that's the way Republicans look at it. It's a question of pragmatism for them. So, of course, this resolution didn't pass. And so I thought, well, the next iteration would be somewhat different. And I'm on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. And on that committee, we sort of take a stand that we don't talk about climate change because that's just too upsetting. So we don't mention climate change. What we do debate about are the costs of different energy sources, or what are the costs of this? This is the sort of the field of debate is always about the economic impacts or the costs. So I thought that the next version of my bill on climate action would focus on costs. And so the bill that I'm introducing next and is already it's already in draft form. I can't really show it here because it hasn't been published yet, but it's basically to establish a study committee to look at the costs of climate damage over a 20-year period and a 50-year period, various scenarios, whether we, try to reduce emissions or whether the Trump administration now is going to try to bend the curve upward again and we actually increase our greenhouse gas emissions. What are the various scenarios? What are the likely scenarios in the next 20, 50 years? And what are the damages that we're looking at as a state? And being fiscally prudent and responsible people, how can we best prepare to pay for those damages? And so part of the committee's scope of study will be to look at the best means of recouping the costs of climate damage, including legal action against polluters. Again, I think that probably the basis will be state law, commercial fraud. Although, the way I look at it, it's kind of like when they got Al Capone on tax evasion. If you think about the immensity of the crime, not just against the people of New Hampshire, but the people of the entire world, and all the life forms, I don't really think we have statutes that cover what I call ecocide. I mean, we have laws internationally against genocide, but what do we do when people have knowingly committed, crimes against entire ecosystems and species? So I don't think that commercial fraud quite covers it, but at least if we can get them on that, that's something. So the study committee will look at the best means of recouping costs, including legal action, including fees, which Mike was talking about, including municipal bonds, including insurance. So what are the best means of approaching the problem? So again, I mean, everything's changed now with the recent election. I don't really expect that this bill has a chance to pass, but I'm hoping that the debate will continue to fly the flag of climate action. It's something that I think Democrats should have run a lot harder on in the last election, and I think that we can be sowing the ground for the next electoral cycle, and it's something that we ought to proclaim loudly. It's as we know, it's an existential problem that we're facing. It's going to present incredible destructive problems for us in terms of our economy, in terms of our healthcare, infrastructure, all sorts of things we're going to have to take care of. So I'm hoping that this will also be an anchor for activism, for grassroots action, and so look out for that bill when it gets produced in the State House. And that's about it for me. I'm willing to take questions. I'll turn it back to Reinmar.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Representative Caplan. And I do want to underline kind of your closing statement there, which is this needs to be part of a public discussion at a much higher decibel level than it has been. A lot of people don't know that this is happening. This is an ongoing issue. It's not always in the media as it should be, but this is one of the major generalized approaches that we need to take. It's one of the most easily defensible, I think, and that's and it's not just happening in New England, in the U.S. It's happening really at a global scale now, and that's how it should be. So I would love to take questions from everybody. We've got a couple in there. I want to start them off by asking something that came up in Tony's presentation also, which is about we've been talking about human rights, right? Rights of humans. What about the rights of nature? And I guess I would direct this at Carly maybe, or to Carly. Do you know if there's any, what kind of progress is being made on a legal basis for the rights of nature? I know that there are in some places, Ecuador, I think, certain
And Costa Rica
um,
as well in their
Costa Rica.
constitution.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Talk about that
Yeah.
if you would.
And specifically, do you mean the human right to like the environment or the kind of rights of nature as an inherent
Yeah,
entity
well,
unto of
I
itself, I
guess
guess?
both. I mean, human rights are there, and there's various ways of approaching human rights in the context of climate chaos. But there's also what Tony kind of mentioned, is there's also the idea that other aspects of nature, of the natural world, also have rights, and that can be legally defended as well. And I'm just not sure whether that. I know that, for instance, rivers have been designated as entities that potentially have legal rights. I think one of the rivers in Ecuador, um, but I just
Yeah.
don't know what's going on in that direction, and whether that's looks like a an avenue that can be pursued productively.
Yeah. I know with the human right to nature, human right to the environment, that was one of the key things that was important in the Montana case that I mentioned. But
Right.
I also know that that's part of constitutions in national governments, like I mentioned in Costa Rica, and that's being applied to climate cases. That's also part of the arguments that are being made before some of these international courts that are going to be issuing advisory opinions, is whether or not all humans have the right to an environment, right to nature, but I'm not aware of any cases, which does not mean they do not exist. I'm not a lawyer, to be clear, of cases that are looking at the specific rights of nature in and of itself. Um,
Hmm.
I would imagine that they exist, but they are not on my radar.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So, what other questions do we have now from the audience? Let's see. I think there was one or two excellent ones. Catherine asks, how do we, as New Hampshire residents, petition our state government to withdraw from the lawsuits that's suing Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, etc.? What is that called? Mike already answered and said it's Alabama versus California. Does anybody know how and who we should address ourselves to if we want to petition to withdraw from that absurd lawsuit?
All,
I mean,
all,
you could
all
start a petition and you could present the petition to the Department of Justice. Um, you could also introduce a House resolution or a Senate resolution calling on the Attorney General to do the same.
Do you know, Tony, if there's anybody doing that now, or Mike?
I haven't heard of that myself. No, I don't think
Hmm.
that's something.
yeah, not
And
to my knowledge either.
Not to your knowledge. Yeah. Okay.
and frankly, there wouldn't be a lot of appetite for that at this point, given that we're in the Senate is in a super minority, and we're in a we're down 40 seats in the New Hampshire House.
Hmm.
Uh, Somebody might want to do it in the same sense that I'm doing this bill on the study commission looking at climate costs in terms of just an activist piece and flying the flag of climate action without really much hope of it passing.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I mean, that's not to say that a petition might not be just as you know useful.
Well, I mean, maybe that leads to a broader question also, which is, how do you all see the next 4 years playing out? I mean, it's hard to say at this point, but what kinds of roadblocks or opportunities are likely to play out in terms of the courts? How much do you feel like the courts will be, at various levels, will be affected by the results of the election?
You know, the courts are one of the areas where I think you're going to see a lot more action in future years. You know, again, lawsuits are not a substitute for climate policy through Congress and legislatures, but they can provide a measure of justice and accountability. And under different state laws, you can seek different remedies to hold polluters accountable, to make polluters pay, to try to stop some of this ongoing deception that is really at the heart of the climate crisis. It's how we got into this mess. The oil companies are going to try to get out of these cases as much as they can. But you know, our court system, I will say, on the previous battles in these cases that I talked about today, it was a question of jurisdiction. The cases have gotten filed in state courts. The oil companies tried to move them to federal courts where they thought they had a better chance of escaping accountability. Unanimously across the country, every federal judge, whether they were appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, rejected the oil companies' arguments on jurisdiction in that case. So this is, I think, a really important thing to watch. I'm also going to drop one of our projects. This is reports on a lot of these climate accountability stories. I'm going to drop that here. This is Exxon News, which is a reporting project of CCI. And our reporter who leads this actually just wrote a piece kind of looking at the prospects for these lawsuits under Trump administration, right? What the administration can and can't do. That's our most recent issue there. You know, one of the things we've known that the oil companies have tried at least twice, there's been public evidence for it, is trying to get what's called a liability waiver, trying to get immunity from lawsuits. It's what the gun manufacturers have. We fully expect them to try that in this upcoming Congress. And I think this is an important issue where, you know, corporate accountability, access to the courts really matter. And if a measure like that comes up, that's an important time to contact representatives and let your voices be heard.
Mhm.
And if
Yeah,
I can
But in
add
terms
to
of
that,
but in terms of, you know, meddling in state court lawsuits that are moving forward in state courts, I mean, we're like I said, with those sort of Hail Mary plays to the Supreme Court, we're seeing the fossil fuel industry trying what they can legally, but to date they have not been able to escape these cases, and you know, Massachusetts at the front of the line marching toward trial.
And
yeah,
Carly, you had to comment. Yeah.
and that's exactly what I was going to add. I think that with Massachusetts potentially going to trial next year, which would be really exciting, I think that across the board, regardless of how you identify politically, no one likes to be lied to. And I think that the evidence of that is so strong already, but I think having it laid out over court proceedings will make it all the more obvious to folks exactly what went down, and like Mike said, what is continuing to happen. That I think that could be a catalyst for additional action legislatively or in litigation.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that I mean, how rapidly will the impact of a new administration have effects on the courts? You know, I mean, they're not immune by any means to various kinds of influence, including just replacement of judges. Are you looking at that happening rather soon, or do we have time in which some of these lawsuits can be played out before we have a change in the guard at the court level?
Well, so an important thing to note about the cases I talked about today is that they're all filed in state courts. And while
Mm-hmm.
the president appoints federal judges, states have their, you know, some states, state judges are appointed, in other states they are elected. But in a lot of ways, I mean, like I was just mentioning on that basic jurisdictional issue, what many judges have said and many legal experts have said about these cases is there's actually nothing very novel about these climate accountability lawsuits, right? They are trying to apply very well-worn legal traditions. You sell a harmful product and lie about it, you should be held liable, right? And you can do that under various state laws. And it might be new to hear about that in the context of climate change. But I think the story of these cases, too, to Carly's point, really can help historically set the record straight and help, just in public discourse, promote some accountability here, so that, so many folks who care about the climate, we all feel such tremendous guilt in our own part. And oil companies want us to feel that way, right? Like there's the famous example of BP hiring a public relations firm that helped them pioneer the idea of a personal carbon footprint calculator, which you can still go on BP's website and calculate your personal carbon footprint. Why would an oil company want you to do that? Right? So I think just in all climate conversations, just centering it in that really simple truth that we are not all responsible, and we should hold accountable those who bear the greatest responsibility.
Seems like an obvious principle. John has a question. Go ahead, John. You want to share verbally? John Gage.
Thank you. Yeah, so trying to find my question. What can we do to make the New Hampshire public more aware of what is going on to help build support for action in the state legislature?
I mean, I have an opinion on that. I think given the polarized nature of Americans in general today, the best way to approach this problem is to talk about the economy and talk about what it's going to cost, and nobody can deny that we're looking at climate change. Our winters are 3 weeks shorter than they used to be. We're seeing flooding, we're seeing droughts. Who's going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for it? That's got to be on everybody's mind. If you're a thinking human being, right? And if you have kids, or grandkids, you're wondering how are we going to adapt? How are we going to mitigate? And who's going to take care of the problem? That's the basis on which you can have a discussion about this. Climate change, yeah, sure, you can talk about that with people that are on board, but so many people are victims of misinformation nowadays that you might just lose them on that just by saying the word climate change. So
yeah,
there's 1.3 million people across the state or so, and I've been talking to people, but it kind of seems like this is a mass media problem to solve as opposed to individual conversations. The polls show 3/4 of Americans or so are in favor of solutions like a carbon fee on fossil fuel production and a full rebate of the money back to households. And well over half are concerned about climate change, but very few people know what they can do other than what they've been told by the fossil fuel industry. Watch your carbon footprint, which is pretty much an exercise in keeping people busy and taking their eye off of what really needs to be done, which is policy changes. But NPR and the other major media outlets don't seem to have much interest in talking about policy.
well, I mean, neither does the Democratic Party. I mean, to be honest with you, Kamala did not mention climate change once in her entire campaign. So it's the problem of the Overton window, which we know about, right? Is that we've let the Republicans set the discourse for the last 30 or 40 years, and it's an uphill battle now. It doesn't mean we can still talk about it. You just have to talk about it in terms of people understand.
Mary Woodward has a related question. She says the International Chamber of Commerce recently issued a report about the enormous cost of climate change, how much it's costing the economy, et cetera, and the urgent need for coordinated action. Do reports such as these have any influence on cases or governing bodies, such as the New Hampshire legislature, or on the courts? In the courts, I mean, these kinds of reports, are they are they valuable contributions? That's from the International Chamber of Commerce.
Well, I mean, that report would be very interesting for if this study committee bill does pass, that's the kind of evidence that that a committee would be looking at in terms of costs. We have we do need those reports for sure.
Carly, when you guys are looking for support for cases, would something coming from the International Chamber of Commerce be seen as particularly valuable, potentially powerful? I don't know how scientific it is, but I suppose they must be getting their numbers from somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the International Chamber of Commerce, but I know that what we have found, and we don't bring cases, right? We support cases to make sure they have the best evidence. But what we found is that consensus documents like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports, that show the consensus of a large group of scientists or economists often fare the best. And so I would imagine, I don't know how the ICC works, but I would imagine that they represent a consensus in some fashion.
Yeah. Let's see. Susan's had her hand up for a little while. Susan Richmond, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to get some questions from the chat before they're lost. Kate Messner had asked, knowing we cannot use the term climate change with certain reps of a certain party, how can we communicate our concerns? Or is that, do we have to always be able to put it into dollars and cents?
Well, I mean, I think, as a state rep, I mean, we're open to our constituents and their opinions, however they're voiced. So, I mean, I would not have any fear about approaching a state rep and talking about your concerns about climate change. If they represent you, they should listen to what you have to say. When I said that we're sort of politely not, treading lightly around the issue of climate change, that just is for the benefit of, discussion on our committee so that we don't constantly go at each other. It's a sort of a gentle ladies agreement to talk about things related to climate without referring to the science of climate change. Unless we absolutely have to. And sometimes we have to.
Yeah.
As a advocate who works in communications, I would just say never be ashamed to say climate. And regardless of what someone or the numbers are going to tell you, if we can't talk about the problem, we're not going to confront it. But there are, I think, adjustments that we can make. There's a lot of public opinion research that shows framing it in terms of extreme weather and talking about the consequences of climate change, right? Don't necessarily just lead with climate change, but say, hey, these hotter summers and the floods, really illustrate visceral impacts. Another frame that a lot of people recommend, and again, there's lots of research on this, there's lots of debates in the advocacy community, but instead of talking about climate change or emissions, just framing this as a pollution issue, right? What is this about? It's about climate pollution. It's about fossil fuel pollution. That's a term other people might be more familiar with and can just kind of wrap their heads around that concept. So I just say, especially on a local level, being specific is always going to be the best.
Yeah. And I think one can go farther and say, this it's a waste management issue. I mean, this is wastes that are going into the atmosphere for free. That's not the way other industries are run and are regulated. If you're producing a toxic product as a waste product, you're responsible for what happens to it after it leaves your factory, and it should be the case with your smokestack as well. C. Gurshimala. Question.
Thanks, Grismala. Much appreciated.
Grismala.
A quick thank you to Mike, Carly, and Tony for your time and presenting. Thank you very much. This has been very informative. A question for Representative Caplan. What is the appetite for citizen advisory committees or something where, to John's point, a majority of citizens in New Hampshire are concerned about climate at the very least, although across party lines it seems to be debatable as Republican candidates I'm seeing to take a stance against it. Is there an appetite for allowing citizens to decide or advise on some of the things that could benefit from a climate or pollution perspective?
I think it's a great idea. I think, that would be a really useful thing and a really very democratic thing to have a citizens committee advising legislators on, potentially really important legislation or a path ahead on in terms of what action to take to recoup the cost of climate damage. There's other issues too I can think of that would be great to have. There's a forestry bill that I have to protect old growth and mature forests, and that's a really sensitive topic in the state as well. And it would be great to have a citizens advisory committee to advise us on, what rights the public has to information about our forestry resource. So, I think that's a great idea. I haven't heard a lot of talk about it, but it's certainly something that I would be willing to spread the word about and advocate for. So yeah, get in touch with me if you have any experience with setting those up, or if you're interested in that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Could I ask one more as well?
Go ahead.
Thank you. This one's more to Mike and Carly. I'm just curious what some of the expected outcomes are from a lot of these political cases holding oil companies accountable. To look at the extreme, if an oil company said, "You're right, we'll stop drilling for oil," it would have significant impacts on increasing energy costs for citizens and making travel and transportation more costly. So what are some of the outcomes that we're expecting out of these cases that are going to lead people to more climate action and seeing that we can hold oil companies accountable?
Well, again, just to clarify, the lawsuits themselves are not saying that they can't continue to produce fossil fuels or drill. The lawsuits in no way are trying to actually mitigate climate change, right? They're about stopping deception, and they're about making them pay for the damages that they've caused. So that's I think a very important point. The oil companies are going to say what they're going to say, right? I read things from the industry every week where they're saying, these are going to raise prices. They've kept us addicted to their dirty fossil fuels for decades, right? Fossil fuels are the prices are very volatile. In terms of expected outcomes, let me just talk about Massachusetts just as like one example of one at the front of the line. So one, it would be ExxonMobil could not mislead the consumers of Massachusetts anymore. And Massachusetts, in its lawsuit, one of the remedies it asks for is making Exxon pay $5,000 for every time it has violated Massachusetts's consumer protection law. So every time it has misled consumers in the state of Massachusetts. How many ads do you think ExxonMobil has run in Massachusetts over the years? Times that by $5,000. And that's the answer to why they hate these cases and are going to fight them tooth and nail.
John.
So the UN chief a little while ago said that the world should revoke permission from the fossil fuel to be able to advertise. And I know, in the big tobacco settlement, one of the things that the government did was revoke permission to advertise. Are any of the suits that are active now kind of trying to do to the fossil fuel industry what was done to the tobacco industry, and kind of take away some of the tools they have to mislead?
In the states, if you look at the specific lawsuits and go to the end where they start listing remedies, they don't necessarily reach that far. They just say you can't lie, right? If you're honest about what your products do and what your business is selling, right? That's all attorneys general are asking for under state consumer protection laws is don't lie to the people in my state. There have been, other proposals, I think, internationally to really curb fossil fuel advertising in general. And there's interesting movements, a partner organization called Clean Creatives that's focused on trying to get PR companies to boycott working with fossil fuel clients. So there are people kind of looking at that issue.
Great. Well, I want to thank our guest speakers very heartily for their contributions. It was really, really good. This is extremely valuable for everybody to hear, and we need to keep on it. So we will do whatever we can to support what you all are doing, Tony, Carly, and Mike, all three of you. And just let us know at the network if there's anything particular that we can do through our membership to support your work. And now I just want to turn this over quickly to Susan Richmond, who has some coming attractions to talk about. Susan, are you unmuted?
I can move ahead and talk about this if Susan is unable to unmute. So our
Go
next
ahead, Mary.
meeting is going to be about the aftermath of fast fashion and the environmental impact of discarded clothing on public health and the environment. And our speaker will be Dr. Julia DeVoy from Boston College, and that'll be December 9th at 6 p.m. On a webinar just like this. So you can keep your eye out for that and look for a registration page pretty quickly. We have a bunch of other important events coming up too. Like I have 3 or 4 more slides. Who wanted to talk? Oh, I guess I'll talk about this too, since I'm the person who's organizing this meeting too. So on Thursday, November 23rd, as usual, the 3rd Thursday of every month at 3, easy to remember, 3rd Thursday at 3, Sarah and others from Clean Energy New Hampshire are going to talk about how the election might impact our collective energy committee work. So this meeting is primarily for people who are on energy committees like the Peterborough Energy Committee or the Merrimack Energy Committee, but anybody can attend. And so we'll hear from Sarah and Clean Energy New Hampshire and have a discussion about that. All right. And the next thing, in general, follow us on newhampshirenetwork.org. And I think we have the last, we've got a couple different working groups, plastics, as was mentioned already, climate, municipal energy committees. That's the one that I just mentioned. That's the 3rd Thursday at 3, one on environment and one on legislation. And newhampshirenetwork.org has all this information and our regular meeting time, so you can go there to learn more about that. And this last request is a timely one that's kind of like a citizen user group. So ISO New England has a consumer liaison group. Now, ISO New England sets the rates for our electricity well, they decide where we're going to buy from, like whether it's coal or natural gas or nuclear or whatever. And so historically, this consumer liaison group meeting has been sort of kind of just cronies of the utilities. Any ratepayer can be on the consumer liaison group. And in the past, it was like people who worked for Liberty Utilities. Well, 2 years ago, a group of us got together and went in person to the consumer liaison group elections and elected people who care much more about clean energy. So my call to action to each of you is to please go to this meeting and vote for people who are in favor of clean energy. We've got 3 names so far: Kendra Ford, Nathan Phillips, and Regine Spector. We will have more names for you. You can attend online with this WebEx link. You don't even have to register, but it's December 4th from 12:30 to 3, or you can go in person. You can drive down to the Colonnade Hotel in Boston and get a fabulous, expensive, delicious free lunch that is paid for by your ratepayer dollars. and then vote. So the voting happens about 3/4 of the way through the meeting. And the purpose here is we want people who care about the clean energy to kind of have an influence and get ISO New England to really think about this a little bit more. I've got a few more details on the next page. I talked to you a little bit about 2 years ago when we went and voted people who care about clean energy in, and Don Kreese, the New Hampshire consumer advocate, wrote about it, and he called it a ballroom coup. And when we send out these slides, you can read that article. But these are for 2-year positions. So now that the ISO New England is onto us, we're a little worried that they're going to have all of their, Liberty Utilities friends come and vote for their Liberty's Utilities ratepayers, as opposed to these people who are in favor of clean energy. So some of the things that we've accomplished in the past couple of years is, it used to be that all of the meetings were like at swanky hotels that cost ratepayers a whole bunch of money for them to have a free lunch. We've instead tried to move the meetings to like a community center in Roxbury, a UMass cafeteria, things like that, to get them more in the people. We have a local guest speaker come and talk about energy issues in each of the areas. They have quarterly meetings and they have to move around the New England states. So one meeting might be in Burlington, one meeting might be in Boston, et cetera. And we continually ask them to bring in more speakers and to think about clean energy. The very first meeting I went to with these folks, we had a speaker from FERC who got up and within the first 2 minutes told us that New England was pipeline poor. So that's the kind of thing that we are fighting against. I know this has kind of been a big brain dump, but we'll be sending out the slides. And if you could make the time to attend the meeting in person or online, that would be really great. And also give me an email, send me an email if you have registered, because I want to make sure I email you all the names of the people you're supposed to vote for. You've got 3 right here, but we haven't finished the slate of people yet. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Beth Raven. Very useful and interesting. And I want to thank again Dr. Carly Phillips, Mike Meno, and Representative Tony Caplan for their contributions to this evening. We really appreciate it, and we will stay in touch about this issue, this ongoing and emerging issue. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Tony, and we will see you on December 9th, if not before, for our next event. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for everything that you do. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night, John.